podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another meeting of our online book club for the Everlasting Man. My name is Joe Grabowski. I'm the VP for Evangelization and Mission here at the Society of G.K. Chesterton, and joined as very often is the case by my colleague and co-host of our Uncommon Sense podcast, Grettelyn Darkey. Hi, Grettelyn.
Hi there.
And we have two very special guests with us today from the Memphis Chesterton Society, and I can let them introduce themselves, but they are Dr. Ken Steorts and Steve McIntyre. Ken, why don't we start with you?
Hey, everybody. I'm Ken Steorts. I'm the founder. Well, I'm the founder of the Memphis Chesterton Society for Memphis, and I started about 5 years ago. My journey is one as a creative guitar player, musician, worship leader. Ultimately, a late bloomer into the church as a college student by this book handed to me as a freshman, and found my way from theosophy to reality. And I subsequently have spent a lot of years in leadership in the church, leading worship, things like that. Started a band in the Christian market here in the U.S. called Skillet, and went on to start a school because I thought there should be more skillets and should be more creative Christians living in community and writing music and serving the church and serving the Lord. So enjoy doing that through Visible Music College. So I'm Dr. Ken at the school, and I'm just Ken on his British bike, motorcycle, other times of the day. So just that dude that talks about Chesterton too much.
Well, great, and maybe we can have Jen pop a link to Visible Music College in the chat for everyone. Steve, how about yourself?
Well, I'm not nearly as special a guest as Ken is. I can assure you. My probably only claim to fame is that I've been able to go almost 67 years with virtually no credentials whatsoever. So the only reason I'm here is because Ken invited me, and because he knows my love for G.K. Chesterton and for Everlasting Man, and particularly this chapter, which I consider the high water mark of all high water mark. That Chesterton is one big high water mark, and this is the biggest one right here, this chapter. So it is a great honor to be able to discuss that with you.
Well, that's great. Well, welcome to you both, and we will get into this very special chapter. I tend to agree that this is a big one, and I think we're going to have a lot of fun discussing it. We always have an icebreaker, though, and welcome to all those tuning in the chat. I'm seeing people from all over, not only the country, but a couple of Canadians in there, and there was some discourse surrounding spelunking at some point as we were getting ready, so it's good to see the energy in the chat. But our icebreaker today is, we know we're going to get to meet people up in the great beyond at the wedding banquet of the Lamb after this life. Who would you want at your table, or who do you want to sit next to, let's say? Your top pick of dinner conversation in the afterlife. Who wants to start?
Chesterton doesn't count.
Yeah, Chesterton.
That's
let's
obvious,
avoid for this one. Other than Chesterton, who would you want to sitting on your other side? Any thoughts? I'll go first, and I was thinking about this today, but I think if granted the Chesterton is going to be on one of the sides, I think Thomas Aquinas is going to be kind of somebody I'd love to chat with and just find out how his mind works conversationally. As opposed to, reading him, which is one experience of the man, but I'm sure he had a great personality to match that great mind of his, and I'd love to, just ask him about his hobbies and interests. So, how about you, Grettelyn?
Well, I want to say Churchill, but I think he'd be too scary, so I don't know if I would be have enough courage to ask any questions. So probably Jane Austen, I think, would be really fun to pick her brain a little. And I don't know, she seemed like a very careful, thoughtful person. One of those people that's quiet but more interesting than you think. So yeah, that's what I would say.
All right. How about you, Steve and Ken?
I'm going to go with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Just built the whole school on his concept of community, and I just don't know how long I'll be able to hold a conversation with him, but just to go from current events of the time, and also starting a school and being involved in everything he was involved in, plus just unwind the concepts of community with him, or just listen, I guess.
All right. Steve?
Okay, this is, if you can't come from a Protestant background like myself, whenever you have a question like this in Sunday school, the answer is always Jesus.
Yep.
That should have been the other
Again,
one
that's a
you
little
can't
too
pick.
obvious. The others, I've got family members, obviously, that, but then I'd make one of them mad if I picked one over the other. So I said, no, not family member. And so I picked a very obscure Saint Mercurius, who was a Roman soldier martyred in the 3rd century. And I kind of pictured him kind of like the kid in the lunchroom sitting by himself, because nobody really knows who he is. And so I'm going to go, but I think it'd be an extremely interesting historical figure, and also and a religious figure, as amazing story, a wonderful story. And I think his story also kind of goes along with the chapter tonight. I think. So anyway, that's who I picked, Saint Mercurius.
Well, great. Well, we have some repeats in the chat and some new ones. So a few Aquinas and some other Dominican saints named: Catherine of Siena, Dominic himself, Mary Magdalene gets mentioned, Padre Pio, Claire of Assisi, Saint Joseph. Karen, your sister Joni, how sweet. Indeed, many of us have those very personal ones that we're hoping to catch up on. Maximilian, that's today's feast day. Maximilian Kolbe, Francis Philip Neri, and Old Thunder himself, Hilaire Belloc. Yeah, I think his conversation might be monopolized by Gilbert. I'm sure.
I was going to say, try sitting between them.
Yeah, they had a lot to catch up on. So, C.S. Lewis, Saint Philip, another for Saint Philip, and Saint John Paul II. So, lots of great answers. Thank you once again, everybody participating and joining in. We're going to hop into our discussion, though, because, as has already been said, this is a huge chapter. So, plan of the book, we came from all through part 1 on the creature called man, and now we're on part 2 on the man called Christ. And as we began with the man in the cave, now we begin with the God in the cave. And so the first discussion question, how is God a caveman? Really, I think what I'd be interested in knowing is who was raised with that as a particular tradition. It's kind of funny to me. I remember arguing in like middle school about this with people, because there were you would see some creches, nativity scenes set up where it appeared to be a cave, and others that appeared to be a freestanding like barn, let's say. And depending on what you were raised with, like kids got really, really defensive over their particular image of what that scene was. So yeah, just curious. Tell us in the chat too. But for the panelists, any strong feelings about this, or do you remember being raised with one tradition in preference to the other?
I never remember ever being discussed that the incarnation occurred in a cave, and so I think this book was the first time I was introduced to the idea, and it was, a great revelation. Especially after, the first of the book, where, he discusses the man in the cave, et cetera, and then builds to this point, and then, kind of drops this bomb on you. And you're going, actually, that's what that's how it have been.
Yeah, I thought it was a stretch a little bit. Like originally when I first saw this, like, what are you talking about in the cave? I literally ignorant growing up. So
yeah. Well, this is after his own visits to the Holy Land, of course, and Chesterton would have had some experience and knowledge there, and so it's not an unfounded supposition, because it is even the case today where, in the archaeological digs and things, you can kind of, and you can just sort of see it by the let's say geological structure of Jerusalem, that it's built into hills, and of course people kind of, well, this is Jerusalem, but same goes for Bethlehem, really, that they would build into hillsides and things like that. I mean, sort of makes sense. Save yourself the cost of the walls and use the earth itself to protect you from the cold winter and things like that. So, however, what Chesterton does with this is just so beautiful. And so on page 279, as has already been quoted by who put it up here for us, I think it was Jeff Miller in the chat. God also was a caveman and had also traced strange shapes of creatures curiously colored upon the wall of the worlds, but the pictures that he had made came to life. And so Chesterton is so wonderful at these symmetries. And indeed, I think Christianity and the Christian imagination has been caught up with them too, whether it be the garden in which man fell, and then God as man in a garden, undoes that terrible fall, and then the sort of even the resurrection pictured as, because remember, he's mistaken for a gardener, right? So there's this God walking in the garden at the beginning and the end of the story. It's beautiful symmetry. Yeah. But then he also talks about another aspect of the cave, God being born in a cave. Why? So there's the symmetry of the cavemen, but there's another sort of metaphysical, if anybody wants to guess what I'm alluding to here, that it's under the earth. What else is under the earth?
It has that beautiful part where he talks about the whole kind of picture being turned upside down. That we think of hell being under the earth, but in this case, heaven is under the earth.
Yes.
And that's just, everything is turned on its head. And that's, of course, Chesterton, surprise, surprise, a key for the rest of the story, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it is beautiful. And skipping down a little bit in the discussion questions from the end of the book, one of them is, what does Chesterton suggest is one of the main symbolic meanings of Christ being born in a cave or a stable? And this is on page 284 for those following in the book. And the quote reads, whether as a myth or a mystery, Christ was obviously conceived as born in a hole in the rocks, primarily because it marked the position of one outcast and homeless. Nevertheless, it is true, as I have said, that the cave has not been so commonly or so clearly used as a symbol as the other realities that surrounded that first Christmas. Yeah, I think. And any thoughts on that aspect of things? As both you, Ken, and Steve said, this is sort of it opens up the story a little bit, doesn't it?
Well, definitely. I think it's this. Obviously, that's the main idea about the outcast and the homeless. He identifying in that way. The story identifies in that way. But then later on, there's also the idea that I'm intrigued with, is that the cave also could represent, as he says on page 297, an outlaw's den or a hiding place from enemies. And so it has layers of meaning that are significance, I guess, for the story itself.
Yeah, it immediately speaks to me of the humility as well, of just under the earth and on the ground. I mean, could the stable already was representing that, or that kind of setting, but it's under the ground in presumably dirt floor, straw, and all the just in creation born on the ground nearly, so it feels like the light creation and foreshadowing the tomb at the end, the back in the cave, sort of. Yeah, beautiful.
Grettelyn, any thoughts?
Yeah, it just makes me think of that when you were saying, Ken, the humility. It's, there's that scripture passage that he became little less than the angels. It's like the lowest of the low, and he's coming into the lowest of the low creation in like the lowest possible way. It's really beautiful.
Yeah. It's just a, you know, it's the mystery that I think Chesterton, more than any in the faith, meditated upon. It certainly seems to me from his writing, he's much more. I think I said last week on the episode that if he ever takes one of those kind of names appropriate to a saint, if he is sainted one day, he'll be like Saint Gilbert of the Incarnation or something, because he's caught up with the mystery of Christmas so much, and there is just so much going on there that. But Chesterton, he always has that adventurous streak in him and that swashbuckler. He was raised reading Penny Dreadfuls and those kinds of stories, and so you do get that idea, Steve, that this is an undermining in a war. Like it's like almost like this is the sappers going in, tunneling under the enemy foundations to blow things up from the very bottom, and everything's gonna change now.
Yeah, and it's often the most neglected part of the story. Chesterton really pulls it out in a way that I had never considered. That almost the most important part of the story is that he's come to do battle. It's a war, and we get to join in on that, and it's or participate in that. And it's awesome.
Yeah, and we are, since our first parents sort of betrayed God, but he comes to us to fight on our side. That's such a beautiful act of love, Yeah.
Oh. Well, we have a couple of comments in the chat here that I just want to highlight. Sheila Tobin pointing out that the church also starts below ground in the catacombs, so that symmetry comes full circle all the way there, and that is well observed, and certainly true to to Christ's predictions that as the world received him, as the world treated him, so they will treat us, and that's why he tells us, right, to rejoice in persecution, because what they did first to him, why should we be any better? And then Kiss of Catholic here says that the element of homelessness is important too. It highlights that he is not of the world, as he has no permanent, true or permanent resting place. And
that's a great point. One of the Gospels, Jesus says that the Son of Man, the foxes have holes and the birds have nests, but the Son of Man hath no place to lay his head, and which is true of all of us. The human race has no place to lay its head on this earth, and he comes and identifies with us in that sense. It's humbling for us.
yeah.
It should be. I hope it is.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think this comment on the homelessness and the poor is a nice bit of a segue into next question, which is, what is the significance? What does Chesterton make of the significance? And then what can we make of the significance of the shepherds being chosen as the first ones to whom this good news is proclaimed? Why the shepherds?
The common man. Chesterton's favorite person, right?
Yeah, that's right.
That's one thing anyway.
The worker.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the myth makers, they.
Yeah, it's interesting too. It's we waxed a little bit about this last week, right? So the shepherds aren't in Matthew's version, which is what we read last week as part of the book club. They're in Luke's, and it has been pointed out many times, these sort of differences. Blessed are the poor in spirit in Matthew becomes just blessed are the poor in Luke, right? Luke does seem to have a kind of authorial interest in focusing on the poor, including the material poor, and a particular fondness and closeness to them. And it's interesting. Yes, they are the first ones to be told the good news. You also have the wise men from the east, who, in a certain sense, are the first ones let's say other than Mary and Elizabeth and those figures in the story, they're the first to become aware of it because they have to travel quite a while, right? So it's an interesting thing that he's drawing in the nations with this announcement, and then he's also drawing up the shepherds. But Chesterton has a particular answer about the shepherd. So yes, the common man. He says this is 286. I have the notes here. Men of the people, like the shepherds, men of the popular tradition, had everywhere been the makers of the mythologies. And I do think that we would do well to rest upon this idea a little bit and move forward with this in mind, because mythology is important. It forms a huge part of the first part of this book. So what do we make of this kind of turning point in what he's going about with this chapter about mythology here and the shepherds?
Well, he obviously this chapter pulls everything that went before it together into this story. And so, it's his idea that there are really only 4 types of religion. There's God, the gods or mythology, right? The philosophy or the philosophers, and then the demons.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. Those are the 4. That's really what all all your comparative religions boil down to those 4 things. And so, the idea that all of these are represented in this story of the incarnation, of the birth of Jesus. They're all there. God, the myth makers, the philosophers, and the demons are all present in the story. They all make make the scene, if you will. And that's the significance. That's again, Chesterton pulls that together in a way that I had not seen before or understood before. It's great literary criticism, if you will, as well as theology.
I like the way that the shepherds. This is a thread in most every work of Chesterton. Is the wise. It takes a while to come to some revelation, and the common person has the stories, lives around story, lives the stories. It's not a concept; it's real. And they have this immediate response to the vision. They don't need to know 3 years prior, right? Or 9 months prior, whatever it is. They immediately respond. It's sort of that visceral, common person logic. The sort of the person that will respond to the revealing of God quickly, which he gets into eventually talking about. All the religions of the world will eventually respond to God, or would have had they had the opportunity. But the common man is ready to go. It's like they're walking into the village.
That's very astute. I think that plays out. In the Catholic tradition, we have traditions of private revelation, and whether it's we believe Mary appearing or Jesus appearing to somebody, it's always to somebody like super humble. People who can barely write, who can't read, it's those people. It's the sort of like ignorant peasants who can accept him. Like you said, they're open, they're ready. It's beautiful.
Yeah, and that demonstrates typically the pride of the world responds somehow to that, delegitimizing their experience. But it's like, no, the very opposite. This is all wrapped in the common person can understand this. It's the myth fulfilled, really. That's what's
exactly the fulfillment of all mythology, right? And why there could be no more myths after this.
Yeah. Well, we have a couple other comments from the chat I just want to bring in here. Kenneth Stack likes to think that the shepherds are mystics and philosophers, and I think that would resonate with Chesterton. He was a Dickensian, right? He loved reading Charles Dickens, and sometimes there is that simple Cockney plainness that utters profound truths. I think that, I like to think that in Chesterton's own little nativity plays that I'm sure he put on with this little toy theater, the shepherds always were Cockneys. They have that Cockney accent. And then we also have Rob Grieving observing, very astutely, and they were the only ones awake. And yeah, it's pictured as this happening in the middle of the night, right? And there's something about that, though. There is something about the fact that it happens in the middle of the night. It happens when the world is asleep. And so, yeah, it's those that are awake and watching, and therefore the shepherds in that way become a real life anticipation of the parables of the virgins with the wicks and the others that are exhorted to stay awake and watch and wait. But also, I think as we've surfaced in the conversation, they were poor. They were the ones, as the common man, they were also the ones probably who had the most to gain in that region anyway from the promised Messiah. And we see this play out throughout the story, right? Whether it's the fishermen that come follow him, but they're at least, they know that they have a lot to gain because they have been humbled by life's circumstances. It's the proud, it's the rich, it's the haughty, it's those that are either self-righteous or comfortable that are going to have a more difficult time hearing Jesus' message. But these guys were hoping for a change, and so they were ready to receive it gladly when it was proclaimed to them. Also, just put in a little plug. I forget what page it's on that he mentions it, but he mentions the eclogues of Virgil, and if you do get a chance to go and read the fourth eclogue, the so-called messianic eclogue of Virgil. You can read it in a good translation. Trevelyan's translation is very highly recommended. It's a good it's a good tie-in with this to understand what Chesterton's allusion is there, and it is quite remarkable. Grettelyn says it's on page 288. Thank you. It's quite something that these are pastoral poems, and there's in the eclogue right before this one where Dale quotes in the footnote, "Begin, little boy, to know your mother by her smile." So there's this sort of messianic baby thing happening in eclogue 4. I think eclogue 3 is the one with the singing contest, and it's two shepherds basically, like it's a lamb that's going to be the prize. So it's just kind of neat to see how paganism that Virgil represents for Chesterton maybe was being prepared in its art and in its poetry in its own way to receive the gospel once it came about. All right, let's move on for so we're covering God, the gods, and the demons and the philosophers. So the myth makers, with the allusion to tying together the shepherds and Virgil, I think Chesterton is saying they're kind of representative in this of God in the first place, but also of the gods, of that broader common kind of sentiment in people to look for meaning in the world. But now you have the philosophers. So our question from the back of the book: the wise men came out of the east, and what do they represent? So Chesterton says on page 289, they would stand for the same human ideal if their names had really been Confucius or Pythagoras or Plato. They were those who sought not tales, but the truth of things, and since their thirst for truth was itself a thirst for God, they also have had their reward. Any thoughts from all of you on this? Because he goes on page 290 throughout 289, 290 to build upon this theme of the importance of the philosophers being at this way meeting, as it were. Any thoughts?
It seems to tie it pretty strongly to the Eastern religions and the fulfillment thereof. That's representing those that had some piece of the truth, and although always reversed, like finding instead of ancestor worship, there's a child. The opposite. The upside down of everything that Chesterton points out, and that Christ was. So. It seems like to me, I think the wisdom of the world that's not particularly where he goes, I don't think, but it's like that to me. That's representing that slow and because of my past, I think of the wisdom as sort of a pride-inducing thing when not subjected to Christ. When not under the authority, it's prideful and then tied up in false religion ultimately. But
I think too it touches too on like the narrowness of the philosophies in the chapter on philosophy in the beginning of the book. He talks about how each philosophy is like very hyper focused on one thing, and kind of solving the world's problems, but only in one way. Like the
Right.
Buddhist says, you can be content if you want nothing, and like so. But then he turns that on its head and says, Christ came, and the philosophers could all be contained. So it's like this all-containing philosophy, as opposed to these narrow, one-way only kind of philosophies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it ties together, and we did sort of skip over the point of the shepherds being the end of mythology. I don't think that we would call this the end of philosophy, but he does, in a certain way, Chesterton, I think, is trying to point us towards how when he says everything changes, when we say that everything changes at this moment, in this moment, it genuinely does, because now what we looked for, whether it be in myth or whether it be in philosophical wonderings, is no longer beyond the worlds, because it's entered the world. And you just can't overstate that fact, right? It's just, and you could just sit with it all day and meditate upon it, that now we have access. He has this beautiful quotation, Chesterton does, on 290. Buddha would have come from his impersonal paradise to worship a person. Confucius would have come from his temples of ancestor worship to worship a child. Inasmuch as anyone was wise, they would have recognized this thing. They would have recognized this new, and just how new it was, that now God has become man. And you can't really say too much about the weight of that mystery and what that means. Let's see what some of the chat folks are saying. So the 10-wheelers say that being kings or wise men, I feel like probably they can appreciate the sign of the baby and the mother, and that the bowing down would include the mother being the queen. I think it's in tradition that we three kings, we recognize them as kings. They're called magi, and we don't know how many of them there were. Matthew never tells us there are three. Tradition gives us Melchior, Balthazar, and Caspar for the gifts, the three gifts that are brought. But they're probably a big traveling caravan. And we sort of talked last week about this imaginative entering into the story. When you picture that, it's like, if sometimes this is where our popular imagery and our popular imagination can, I think, inhibit us from really getting the crisis of this moment, that we just picture three guys on camels. No big deal. But if you picture this entire giant train of dromedaries and servants and this whole caravan out of the east arriving at the palace of Herod and being like, where's the new king? This is looking to him like this is the start of whoa, so you really have to kind of picture that scene taking place. This, because if they're really far from the east, they're not traveling in a small band. This is going to be a big substantial arrival, and now they're just parked in the courts of Herod, and he's like, what is going on here? Are they going to rise up in rebellion? So it just puts a lot of that into context for us to imagine it. All right. Any other? So Marcia Geary. Oh, sorry, Steve.
No.
Just pointing out from Marcia here that the shepherds were the Jews and the wise men are Gentiles. So this represents, that inclusivity of bringing in the nations with the people. Go ahead, Ken.
Exactly. I was just going to say that the Christian story and the Christian religion, it immediately resonated with every type of person, right? That's why it grew so quickly. It was the story itself, what it represented, but it appealed to the common man, and it appealed to the intellectual. I mean, immediately, right? In the sense that, Christ born of a virgin was not just meant to test our credulity, to see if we would believe the unbelievable, right? It became, or to fulfill a prophecy. It was necessary. From an intellectual standpoint, it was necessary that Christ be born of a virgin in order to save the world and to reconcile the creation back to the Creator. It had to happen that way. When you consider it from an intellectual standpoint, it had to happen that way, not a mythological standpoint. So it appealed to every kind of person, no matter where they were from an educational standpoint or from an economic standpoint or anything else. And that's why it grew so quickly.
One other thought that's sort of in that neighborhood is actually in the neighborhood. I've never thought until this discussion about the wise people, rulers, wisdom, philosophers of the Near East and the neighborhood and the Jewish people. They must have had, in the same way those other religions would be fulfilled, right? In the concept of Buddha and all that. This is the ultimate, like, massive fulfillment of the covenant and law and everything, like, converging at this moment. I just had never considered wise men. The regional wise men would probably have responded, or they certainly had the first opportunity to, in that moment. And it would have been, their world certainly was crashing on the new, second Adam here. They didn't know what they were getting into, but
Yeah.
must have had some response that was not just Herod, as a ruler.
Yeah, it's it is this drama because it's an upsetting of all kinds of norms in society, of also all kinds of expectations in society about who's this for. I mean, even the significance of the wise men coming from outside, from the lands of the Gentiles, that would not have sat well with the Jewish sages, for the scholars and the scribes. They would have, this was not the way it was anticipated to be by their reading,
Right.
at least up to that point. So let's see. We also have this other question that I think we've covered a little bit, but we'll just go through it quickly. How is Christendom larger than creation? And we have a quotation here from page 290 that we must grasp from the first. This character in the new cosmos, that it was larger than the old cosmos. In that sense, Christendom is larger than creation, as creation had been before Christ. Creation had been before Christ. It included things that had not been there, but it also included things that had been there. So I sort of alluded to this earlier with saying that now in creation there's access to something beyond. But yeah, any thoughts on this quote? I think there's more going on here than meets the eye, but I'd be interested to hear what you all think.
I just thought it was such an interesting way to say that it's such a universal thing, and not even like universal in the sense of containing the whole world, but containing like everything even beyond the world. You know, this brings us into the spiritual realm in a way that we couldn't even get before, and you know, I don't know. It's like you had the gods and the demons before, and now you can have angels and saints and all these. Everybody is there who you know, it's beautiful. Anyway, I want to hear from you guys though.
Well, he says at the very beginning of the chapter on 279 that referring to the incarnation and beyond, the second half, he calls it the second half of human history, was like a new creation of the world, which it very much is.
Yeah. It's a beautiful through line in Chesterton too, to always look at things paradoxically, and there is something paradoxical here that now the world is bigger, with God entering into it. You know, we don't think of the operation happening in that way, but that is certainly the case. And it actually, what you just said, Steve, reminds me of that great quote from one of his essays in The Defendant in Defense of Baby Worship, where he talks about how with each new baby, a new universe is created, because there's a mind engaging, and what happens in the mind and imagination and perceptions and senses of that baby is, as it were, a whole new universe. There's something really beautiful about that. And then you imagine God as that baby.
That's great.
You just, what do you do with that? All you can do is pray with that. I think maybe in some sense the less said the better, but it is, you know, I think one of Chesterton's essential points, and this is something that is important, is that he's always incarnational in his approach, which means everything gets caught up in Christ. Everything gets transformed in Christ. So that's what he means by saying there are new things that had not been there now with the incarnation, but everything that had been is also there. And it's all being brought in, which is, you know, why I think it's just such beautiful natural poetry. You know, we believe this really happened, but there's a poetry to it. It's beautiful that it includes animals.
Oh yeah.
You know, it has to. It has to. It has to include the lower creation.
And this is great. The great quote that the hands that had created the universe were too small to reach the huge heads of the cattle. Now that's just mind blowing.
Yes.
Yeah. That's a lyric in a song I wrote for a Christmas show with
Remember
the hand reaching up to touch the nose of the animal that he created. You know, it's
beautiful.
That's a Chestertonian thing.
But it gets your heart because it's
Oh
such
yeah.
oh my
it's
gosh.
such a beautiful image, and yeah, just this whole idea of God. He has this is a theme through the whole chapter. This idea of potency and infancy, and you know how in the world is God the most helpless thing in the world all of a sudden?
Well, and how it's changed, it literally has changed us psychologically, whether we want to admit it or not. The idea, right, of this contrasting idea of the God who is powerful enough to create the universe and a baby. And once you know the Christmas story, you can never separate those two things.
Mm-hmm.
And anyone who has heard the story, I think of you know, in our times, at least in my time, you know, the Charlie Brown Christmas story. And every kid now for 3 generations has watched that and now can watch it continuously. My grandchildren watch it in the summertime. And you know, Linus comes out, you know, everybody's searching for the meaning of Christmas, and Linus comes out and just quotes those few lines from Luke chapter 2, you know, about the shepherds and so forth and so on. And now you've heard it, and it's too late. Now it's too late. Once you've heard it, you've been changed, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the section. Did you find it, Joe? I don't know if you're looking for the same thing where he talks about how the Muslim might be very worthy, the Jew might be very worthy, but they can't conceive of the world in the way that the Christian can because of this reality,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
I can't find it, but yeah.
Well, I remember
Like,
as a non-Christian, I read a lot of was it Watts? That he was a popularizer of Zen Buddhism, and I remember in one time in a quote he said that the Western mind could really never grasp Buddhism, to truly understand Buddhism. And I always wondered what he meant by that. And I thought maybe it was just this theological idea of God and so forth and so on. But it's actually this idea. It's this idea of God born as a child. Anyone who understands that or has known that, there's no way you can understand or fathom Eastern religions, because there's nothing really to fathom. There's nothing at that point, and you realize it. And so it has changed the psychological makeup of the Western world. Let's face it.
It's like when you read Lord of the Rings, you can't watch the movies anymore.
Well, you can.
Just not
But it's
right
the
after
lazy
each
man's
other.
way out.
Yeah, don't hurt. Yeah.
It's like eating candy. After you can have it, but
Yeah, you don't want that. Yep.
Well, it's like reading this chapter. It's like a great opera. Your favorite opera, and there's embedded in the opera on down the line. There's your favorite aria, and you could go straight. You could, if you're from my generation, you had records and you put the needle on the place, and you can listen to your aria over and over again. But it's better if you start at the beginning.
Yeah.
And listen to it all the way through, and then you get to that's what this chapter is like. It's like your favorite aria in your favorite opera.
Love it.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I want to get some final questions in from chat before we wrap here. We have about 12 minutes left, but I do want to just note that there is sort of a summative statement. And I think this is important to just make sure that as we progress, look forward to next week, later, that we get this conversation in first, which is, it begins on page 299, where Chesterton, but speaking about Christ, Chesterton says he wants to sum up the combination of ideas that make up the Christian or Catholic idea, to note that all of them are already crystallized in the Christmas story. So these three ideas, and what are they? He says the first is the human instinct for a heaven that shall be literal and almost as local as a home. And then if you flip over onto page 300, he identifies the second. He says, the second element is a philosophy larger than other philosophies. It looks at the world through 100 windows, where the ancient Stoic or the modern agnostic only looks through one. And then finally, number 3, and we didn't really get to him leading up to this point of the conversation, but it's resting upon Herod. He says the third point is this, that while it is local enough for poetry and larger than any other philosophy, it is also a challenge and a fight. While it is deliberately broadened to embrace every aspect of truth, it is still stiffly embattled against every mode of error. And so this is Chesterton kind of summing up the importance of how he's schematized his, because this is a retelling of the Christmas story in this chapter. He doesn't go into all the details. There are a lot of things that he could have talked about. He could have talked about the gold, the frankincense, and the myrrh. He could have talked about the lead up with the visitation to Elizabeth and everything, but he doesn't. He chooses instead to use this rubric of God, the gods, the demons, and the philosophers, and how they're all there. And these three elements, in a certain sense, are encapsulated with that those who were myth makers, those who were the good kind of pagans, let's say, for Chesterton, they were seeking this they have this human instinct that heaven shall be almost as literal and as local as a home. That, he contrasts the household gods of Rome with the terrible idols of baby sacrifice in Carthage, right? And then the philosophers, obviously, that the problem is it was too narrow, with all other philosophies. And now it's just kind of an explosion of all those ideas, looking out on the world through 100 windows rather than in from one. And then finally, the last hurrah, as it were, and he uses very strong language in this, basically saying that Herod is giving Moloch his final due in a certain sense. That's what Herod engages in. And so the battle lines are drawn. It's just such a lovely schematization and way of meditating on it. Any thoughts about this final kind of way that he sums up what he's been saying in the chapter?
I think it just touches again on the fact that it's such a universal message, and it goes further and into more truth than any other philosophy or religion that came before.
Yeah.
Yeah. We
do have a couple of neat quotes from Angela Martin here in the chat from the book, that every other single system is narrow and insufficient compared to this one. That is not a rhetorical boast. It is a real fact and a real dilemma. And then she quotes another banger of a line. It proclaims peace on earth and never forgets why there was war in heaven. And indeed, it's those one-liners, man. Chesterton's always coming out with those. You can't get enough of them. Final thoughts on this chapter before from our panelists or from the chat. This has been very fun talking through.
My final thought is from the very end, which is, I think, is the real kicker for the whole chapter, where he talks about, the story has an effect on us that we can hardly understand. He says this. He says it is as if he found the man who contemplating the story found something at the back of his own heart that betrayed him into good.
Yeah.
I didn't plan on being good, and I didn't want to be good, but this story betrayed me. Now that's a different way to look at it.
Surprises you from behind.
It does.
That's scriptures coming to mind. You duped me, Lord, and I let myself be duped, right? I think it might be Jeremiah. Yeah. You got me. I love it.
Ken, any final thoughts?
Well, I went into Sheldon Van Auken's thought about when he got stranded on an island moving towards the Lord and couldn't return. Found he couldn't return. I think that's the experience of seekers of all history. They come to this point. I'm gonna dream tonight, I hope, of how did heaven and earth wait 34 years for that total revelation of the kingdom of God and the church. How do we even make it through that time?
Yeah.
And it's it'll be all Christmassy in the middle of August here because of the beauty of the story sneaking up on me even tonight. It's really good.
Grettelyn, final thoughts?
Lots of things. Just, keeping Christmas all year, I think, is one of Chesterton's mantras, and I think we do well to keep it in mind. And like he said, it's a battle, right? There's sort of this lovely false idea that we should just all be able to get along, but once you know the truth, you got to pick a side, right? So, just glad to be on the right side.
That's right.
With Christ and Chesterton.
Well, we have a couple from the chat comments that. Let's see here. The 10 Wheelers say that they love the poem that Dale gives in the commentary. So, from the book, the commentary on the God in the Cave begins with the full excerpt, the full House of Christmas by G.K. Chesterton. There fared a mother driven forth out of an inn to roam. In the place where she was homeless, all men are at home. And so, for that poem alone, just to have it and have it in the context of this chapter is worth. If you haven't yet, go ahead and make sure that you pick up a copy of this particular volume. I'll also put another plug in for another poem that I think this chapter always reminds me of. It's another Chesterton poem, and we can pop it into the chat here. But it's Gloria in Profundis by G.K. Chesterton, which I'll just say the final stanza here really quickly because it's just, but you have to read the whole poem. Glory to God in the lowest, so not glory to God in the highest. Glory to God in the lowest, the spout of the stars in spate, where thunderbolt thinks to be slowest and the lightning fears to be late. As men dive for sunken gem, pursuing we hunt and hound it. The fallen star has found it in the cavern of Bethlehem. So I do commend that one to your reading as well. I want to thank our wonderful guests, Ken Steorts and Steve McIntyre from the Memphis Chesterton Society. If any of you are Tennessee folks, do go and check them out and join into their meetings. Gentlemen, thanks. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. And if you're in Memphis around Christmas time, we do figgy pudding and 100-year-old recipes and gather and read the plays of Francis and Chesterton.
Fantastic. And I just want to say, great guests continue for the podcast, for the book club. We have next week joining us Dr. Josh Russell. He's the headmaster of the Chesterton Academy of the Sacred Heart in Peoria, Illinois. Josh is also one of the academic deans for the Chesterton Schools Network. Very accomplished pianist, just an all-around very interesting guy, musician, scholar, Chesterton headmaster, and I think you'll really get a lot out of his conversation with us as we look at chapter 2, the riddles of the gospel. Thanks to all of you. Thank you, Grettelyn, for joining us as always.
Oh, of course, my pleasure.
Thanks all of you in the chat for being here. It's been such a pleasure. We do enjoy all of what you have to share with us, and we do ask you to obviously send any feedback that you have to podcast@chesterton.org. That's always monitored, so that email address goes to several of us on staff, so you will be seen and you will be heard, and hopefully you will be responded to. It depends. I mean, if you're really rude, you might not be, but I don't think anybody here would fall into that category. And I think that's just about it. If you haven't done so yet, do consider popping the QR code up here by my head right before we sign off to support our work. This great book club that we're doing, all of the poetry that we've been linking to in the show notes that we've been quoting, that you can find for free on our website. All of this is a service that we try to provide to help the world know more about Chesterton and through him, the everlasting man, Jesus Christ. And we cannot do that without your help and support. So please do prayerfully consider what you can bring humbly and place it at the creche in honor of the Chesterton Society, and God will reward you in your giving. Until next time, thanks everyone once again, and God bless.